Hello, hello. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today we are going to be going over the biggest mistakes in hip hop mixing. I've done episodes before about the biggest mistakes in rock mixing, so check that out if you want. But today it's about hip hop. And because there's so much hip hop influence in pop music today, we're also going to be talking about some of the biggest mistakes in pop music mixing. But I think even if you're not mixing hip hop, this episode could still be useful for you because there are some concepts and some principles in here around contrast that are big and apply to every genre. And we're going to have some audio examples today that are really clearly going to illustrate the concepts at play. And I have some great mixes here to show, and also some questionable mixes that will demonstrate some of these concepts. And what we're really going to be diving in on is the single biggest mistake when it comes to hip hop mixing. You're going to get like a 3-for-1 special because I'm going to give you a couple of other additional extra mistakes that often happen in hip hop, but we'll clear those out of the way and get to the biggest mistake and spend the most time on it because I think it's the thing that we have the most control over and is some of the lowest hanging fruit and is one of the least talked about things in mixing, but is so big. Before we get into it, all I've got to do is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. The most important sponsor, as always, being you. How do you sponsor this podcast? Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Make sure you hear about great videos when they come out. Also, best way to sponsor this channel is to sponsor yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, EQ Breakthroughs, Compression Breakthroughs, all guaranteed to change the way that you mix forever for the better or your money back. And there's hip-hop examples in those. If you're into hip-hop mixing, in every single course, I try to include mixes from every genre and in every DAW. These really do change lives. Even if you take the first 90 minutes of these like 8-hour courses, they will change your life forever. The before and after that I get to hear from people doing these courses and the testimonials I get are just out of this world and make me comfortable shilling my own courses till the end of time because they really do help change lives. Also, a big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. And also give one last little shout out to Baby Audio, technically not sponsoring the podcast today, but they were here on the channel checking out their new plugin, the Smooth Operator Pro. There's right now a discount special on that. If you haven't checked it out, go over to the live tab here on our YouTube page and check out the intro special and all the interesting things happening with our newest plugin, Smooth Operator Pro. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get right into the biggest mixing mistakes. And I'm going to save the biggest for the last, but we're going to spend the most time on it. You might be thinking that the biggest hip hop mixing mistake has to do with low end because low end is so important in hip hop. And honestly, it's not the biggest, most common hip hop mixing mistake today. It's still there. I would put it as number 3 common mixing mistake out of the top 3 is that sometimes new and intermediate hip hop producers end up loading their tracks with more low end than they realize. And today's podcast episode was actually inspired by a coaching call I had just earlier today with a hip hop mixer, but it wasn't just him. It was earlier in the week. I had the same thing coming up on a mastering session where someone was asking for mastering feedback on their mixes, hip hop stuff I was mixing. And then not long before that, I had a great person in the members only mix feedback session, give me some references, play his tracks. And these 3 mistakes came up in all of them. For all 3 of these to smaller degrees, but some of these can be big. So the least important one that I want to harp on today is, sometimes you can have excessive low end in your mixes if you end up mixing on small monitors in untreated rooms and you have headphones that don't go down deep enough to let you hear what's going on the low end. But honestly, with the way people are making records today, so much of it being based on samples and virtual instruments that already have really nice, well-balanced low end on them, totally out of whack low end isn't the biggest, most common problem I hear in beginning and intermediate mixers. A lot of these people who are really into hip hop listen to hip hop records and all sorts of systems, make beats, hear their beats on all sorts of systems. That's one of the things they know they've got to get sorted out. And through whatever workarounds they use, a lot of them are able to handle it. However, when there's an error here, it usually is in the form of too much low end below 60 hertz. And counterintuitively, sometimes cutting some of that low end makes the low end sound bigger. I know that sounds weird and backwards. People think it don't be like that, but it do. So that's number 1. Double check with frequency analyzers how the low end on your favorite records looks compared to the low end on your record if you're not able to hear that low. And also, in addition to doing things like the car check and the club check, get headphones that go deep. And this will help you avoid one of the smaller hip-hop mixing mistakes. But the big hip-hop mixing mistake has nothing to do with monitoring, and we'll get into that soon. What's the next biggest hip-hop mixing mistake? Well, I would say number 2 is new and intermediate mixers just being a little bit afraid to put quite enough compression and limiting, and sometimes de-essing, onto hip-hop vocals. Most hip-hop and pop vocals today are compressed or limited a heck of a lot. We're talking about 10 dB being a small amount of compression and limiting. Don't listen to the short clips you see or the magazine articles or the blog articles you see that say, don't compress by more than 3 dB, or once you start compressing by more than 6 dB, you're in trouble. No, not for these genres. We're talking about lots of compression, and not just compression, but potentially limiting or at least really fast attack, high ratio compression. So this is kind of 2B, the fact that in underprocessing vocals, people are often underprocessing with compression and limiting, and they're not biasing enough towards usually faster attack compressors and limiters, which are the sound of modern pop vocals and a lot, but not all, of modern hip hop vocals. If you are just compressing with slower attack compressors, sometimes you get too much transient, too much fricative, the consonant notes or the consonant sounds in the vocalist's performance. And often we really want to smooth out the transients in the initial attack with really fast attack compression. And then if you want some of that kind of punchiness and bite and intelligibility of the vocal back, you might follow it or complement it with a slower attack compressor. So you have 2 types of compression. One that's shaving off our transients, making them really controlled. And the second, re-emphasizing some of that attack that we've shaved off. The idea here is our fast attack compressor is making our attack more consistent, so things aren't really erratic and leaping out, and our slower attack compressor then takes that attack that we've reduced and then amplifies it just a little bit. If you just use a slow attack compressor on vocals, it actually has the effect of making the initial transient impacts of sounds sound less compressed. Yes, compressors can uncompress things in the sense that it can make the initial attack sound even more all over the place because you're not catching the initial attack with a slow attack compressor. You're just catching the later stuff. So that's our second problem. But our third, and this is our most important, biggest mixing mistake is lack of contrast in vocals. What does that mean? Well, this is where we're going to bring up a whole bunch of audio examples and start listening to stuff together. For those of you who say about this podcast, man, all you do is talk. It was 8 minutes before the episode started. Nah, dude, we went over stuff in the first 8 minutes. All of that stuff is important. Am I saving the best for last? Do I take a little while to warm up and get super deep? Yeah, sometimes. And here's where we're going to go super deep and listen to audio examples. And for those of you who have long attention spans and are actually going to improve at things in your lives, this is where the real medicine comes in. Too little contrast in your vocals. And I have some examples here of questionable mixes and really good mixes that take this to the nth degree. Now, what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to play mixes from the people who I was giving mix feedback to, because I don't want to call anyone out. Like, here's a person's mix that could be improved. You know what? That's not the worst thing in the world to do. But I have even better examples. I have examples here of people who take this concept to the extreme. So real quick before I play, we're going to listen to some Snoop Dogg, we're going to listen to some Kendrick Lamar, and we're going to listen to some stuff that you have probably never heard before. But what each of these examples does extremely well is this principle of contrast between lead and background vocals in hip-hop, which is essential to good hip-hop mixing. Often, a lot of us, honestly, working in hip-hop genres, a lot of you guys are getting 2 tracks from your favorite beat makers. You don't even have access to the multi-track. So the one thing you have control over mixing is the vocals. And this is why good vocal mixing is such an important part of good hip-hop mixing. Because honestly, if there's a 2-track, like an instrumental that just isn't banging, you almost just don't use it. Like if the mix isn't good and it's stopping it from being good, instead of remixing in a lot of cases, people are like, no, your track's just not banging. Come back to me with a banging track. When you got one that I don't have to like remix, then I'll use that. And then the big thing that I'm focusing on here is the vocal mix. So this is where you get the most power, the most control for everyone who's doing hip-hop mixing. And we're going to look at some major ways to dramatically change the impact and sound of your song with good hip-hop vocal mixing. So what does good hip-hop vocal mixing entail? Why do I say contrast between your mains and your backgrounds, or your mains and your ad-libs? Well, here's the common problem that I hear so much is someone will mix a single hip-hop vocal and it will be, it have one sound. Like maybe it's kind of dry and bright, and maybe it has a little bit of delay on it. And then the ad-libs or the background vocals have the same exact sound as a lead vocal, with maybe one minor exception. Maybe the backgrounds are panned. Or maybe the backgrounds are ever so slightly darker than the lead. Or maybe the backgrounds have a little smattering of extra delay on them compared to the lead. Nah. Go for bigger contrast, badder contrast. And I'm going to play you an example in just a second that is some of the biggest and baddest contrast I've ever heard, to give you an idea of just how far you can take this. And then as we go further along, I'm going to play you another example of a song that has contrast in the exact opposite way that also works. And then I'm going to play you another song that has really nicely balanced contrast that takes this idea, does it ever so slightly more subtly, but still is just masterful mixing. All right. Let's get into it and play you a little bit of what I mean by having extreme contrast between your vocals. Last quick little preamble I'll give here is, if you do want to really have your lead vocals and your backgrounds, your ad-libs really have a very similar sound to each other, and you can do that. It's allowed. It's not wrong. It's an aesthetic, but it's not the most common or most powerful aesthetic in hip hop. But if you want to do that kind of approach, make sure you are really syncing up your vocals. When you have your backgrounds and your ad-libs, or your backgrounds or your ad-libs sounding the same as your lead practically, whenever they're doubling each other, man, you need to tighten up those doubles dramatically. So you might want to check out something like Vocaline by Synchro Arts, or recently on this channel, we debuted the new Waves plugin, Sync VX, that is great for taking hip-hop vocals and just making them mesh together. Super important, especially if you have really attacky vocals with the initial impacts jumping out at you. Man, if you have a lead and then 2 or 3 backgrounds or ad-libs that are all saying the same word, and they all have the attack falling in slightly different places, you don't get this nice, lovely chorusy effect where it smooths things out. No, you get exactly the opposite. You get this flamming effect where it almost sounds like there's this weird accidental delay on the vocals. Super important that for stacks where you're going to have similar sounds across stacks, particularly when they're very dry and percussive sounds like hip-hop vocals usually are, you got to make sure you align those things. That's just part of the genre. Now, to not have to align those things so much, what you do is you add contrast, and you can get away with them being more different from each other. You got to go even more different. That's what contrast is about. So our first example here is a song called Hennessy and Buddha by Snoop Dogg. It's off the record Last Meal. I think the song has 4 million streams on it or something. Not Snoop Dogg's biggest track, but one that was brought to me as a reference by someone in our mix feedback recently. I think it was maybe in one of our March or February mix feedback sessions. And this one stuck out to me because of how crazy it is. This mix also hammers home another principle, which is that good mixing is not necessarily about making everything heard equally well at all times. It's not necessarily about making things sound well balanced. It's about making things sound interesting and about you emotionally connecting with the track. And I would almost question how far they push the idea of vocal contrast in this. I want you to pay attention to what Snoop's vocal sounds like in the center, and then what the background vocals sound like on the left and right. Here we go. Okay, this is our intro. We're about to get right into the main section coming up in just a second. Here's our first verse.
DPG is down with us. X to the Z is down with us. DRE is down with us. My nigga Cocaine is down with us. Eastside Gang is down with us.
So what are you noticing about the difference between Snoop's vocals that are the main lead and the ad-libs? This is almost too exaggerated, but it's impressive and interesting nonetheless. What's happening with his main vocal is there's a little bit of wetness on it. It's centered. And then the background vocals are so much more upfront. What's bringing them up front? Well, they're panned even harder. there's even more attack left on them, and they're a little bit drier. So we have this lead vocal that's set back ever so slightly, and that brings the background vocals forward. And also being hard panned brings the background vocals forward. So we have this big dichotomy. So even if the ad-libs aren't super precise with the lead, they don't kind of flam against each other. And it makes each of them sound distinct and interesting. In fact, because of how relatively small Snoop's lead vocal is compared to the backgrounds, it makes the background sound huge. And you can do the exact opposite. If you want to have a huge sounding main vocal, have smaller backgrounds. Now, I should say that those stereo things are technically not backgrounds, they're more like, would you call them ad-libs, or they're doubles? I don't know if there's standard hip-hop terminology. Do you think there's standard hip-hop terminology between backgrounds, doubles, and ad-libs? I mean, I could make a case for why that these should be called doubles rather than backgrounds, and they're not quite ad-libs. Well, there's another vocal that's about to come in that's a single line that's centered that is more of a background ad-lib. Listen for that about halfway through this verse.
DPG is down with us. X to the Z is down with us. DRE is down with us. My nigga Cocaine is down with us. Eastside Gang is down with us. Nigga.
So there we go. Eastside. Right, I didn't do the same voice. I chickened out halfway through trying to do an impression, so it didn't come out anywhere near him. But the guy who says Eastside here, again, different vocal texture. What's different about it compared to Snoop's lead and the background vocals? Listen to it.
Cocaine is down with us. Eastside Gang is down with us.
So there's something about that vocal that sounds further away. But is it because it's drenched in reverb? No, it's not drenched in reverb. It's just substantially darker.
Down with us. My nigga Cocaine is down with us. Eastside Gang is down with us. Niggas talking.
So we now have like 3 layers of depth in this vocal. We have up front and around the sides, Snoop's backgrounds. We have Snoop in the center, slightly further back because he's a little wetter and he's not hard panned. And then slightly behind him, there's this other layer of depth. East Side. I still do that right. That sounds like something from Street Fighter the way I did, right? But that background vocal, that East Side, is a further layer back from Snoop, but not by adding a ton of reverb and delay to it, which a lot of people, that's their instinct in mixing hip-hop vocal. Oh, we got to add some depth to it, put more reverb or delay on it. Now, a lot of hip-hop vocals are pretty dry, and that East Side is really fairly dry. You might just use a short room on something like that, if at all, if it's too glued to the front, but then just darkening the top. And if there is any kind of room ambience on it, then that would be darkened. But it's fairly dry, but set back from being dark. Now this track gets even crazier when we get into the chorus and we hear how big and wide and how much contrast they put into these background vocals in the chorus. Let's check that out.
One, with a bullet, motherfuckers. I got this hymn in my cup.
So this is more of a bridge, and we can hear that in this bridge, we have this second vocal sound. It has a different layer of depth than Snoop's. It's a little further back in the mix, a little bit darker. And again, we have this thing where we have bigger background vocals than the lead. But it's going to get even bigger when we get to what is probably a true chorus.
Motherfuckers, I got this hymn in my cup, and this Buddha got me stuck.
Or maybe it's the chorus.
Trying to compose myself.
There it is. Do you hear that?
I just want to be left alone. I'm just trying to enjoy myself.
Do you hear those female background vocals, the compose myself, the enjoy myself? It's almost bigger than the entire track. Now, I'm not going to say this is the most masterful, best mix ever, and maybe those could have been tucked a little bit more. But do you hear the cojones behind that mixing? The idea of, no, we're going to go big on these backgrounds. We want them to leap out at you. For my taste, it's almost a little bit too much, but it illustrates this principle that you find all over hip-hop mixing, where when you want vocals to sound big and impressive, contrast is what does it. When you want things to sound multidimensional and interesting and exciting, this kind of slightly unbalanced mixing is what does it. Unbalanced mixes are exciting mixes. Mixes that are perfectly balanced and everything is smooth, there's a place for those as well. But a lot of them can potentially be less boring, less emotional, less exciting mixes. So if you're going to make mistakes, this is sometimes the way in which to make a mistake. To make a mistake by being a little bit too big, a little bit too bold. And This extremely loud background vocal did not stop this person from using as a reference. This was chosen as a reference. A producer mixer person who has, good taste in records and analyzes records like, man, this track sounds so cool. What is it? Well, just be less fearful with your vocal mixing. Be more fearless.
Side gang is down
Listen to
with
that
us.
again.
Niggas talking shit, I'm getting ready to boss. I'm number one.
Big backgrounds.
One. With a bullet, motherfucker.
And what happens when we get to these female vocals?
I'm just trying to compose myself.
Right? So much drier, so much more upfront. Now, the same person gave me another reference of a hip hop record he really liked. This is a smaller artist named Opali. I'm not sure where they're from. The track is called Se On Se Jaba. I hope I'm saying that right. Someone tell me if I got it wrong, which I probably do. And this track, there's a different approach to the vocal, but there's just as much contrast. Let's hear it. And then we'll get to something I think is done really masterfully and well balanced in this style by Kendrick Lamar. We'll get to in just a sec. But here's Se On Se Jaba.
So se jäbä, jolle maistus väkää. So se jäbä, joten kenen on se syy? Kaikki on vituilla ja huumeita myy. So se jäbä. Jolla lentää räkää. So se jäbä. Keskisormea näyttää, kiinnosti kiviäkin mitä äijä käyttää. So se jäbä. Hei, mitä se taas...
So what do you hear in there in this first kind of opening chorus? And there's two lines here. There's a single line down the center. You could think of it as a response line, or maybe it's a lead. It's hard to say which of these is the lead and which of these is the background, right? But we have almost this time, like the main line of the chorus is kind of this stereo, wide, fairly clean vocal sound, really big, kind of larger than life sound. And then the response to it, almost the background response to its call, is this slightly distorted, mid-rangey, radio-sounding background that's down the center. So here we have an inversion. It's almost main, big, clean, and around, and then centered, distorted background response. Let's hear that one more time. And just that small yeah is going to make the next vocal sound bigger.
So se jäbä, jolle maistus väkää. So se jäbä, joten kenen on se syy? Kaikki on vituilla ja huumeita myy. So se jäbä. Jolla lentää räkää. So se jäbä. Keskisormea näyttää, kiinnosti kiviäkin mitä äijä käyttää. So se jäbä. Hei. Mitä se taas puhuu, eikö poika ikin muutu? Mitä juuri puutu, kuhan huuli puutu? Mitä hommaa,
I love that sniff.
mikä maas? Jos jäbä on pean, tiedä mistä sitä saa. Toiset
So that's interesting. The backgrounds that we have so far in this section are literally like a sniff and a sigh, and they're so much bigger and more hi-fi than the main. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to always be done this way. It can be completely flipped. You can have a main that's super hi-fi, and you can have background vocals that are more lo-fi. So either of these approaches totally works. It depends on the aesthetic. But in general, I'm going to recommend, especially if you're doing stacked backgrounds, that you have significant contrast between your main and your backgrounds. Now, there's some exceptions here. There's like an older school approach to hip hop mixing where you might have just a main and like a single response. You're not stacking responses. And then there's little enough flamming that you can kind of get away with them not being radically different. And that is an older school type of hip hop mixing that can be valid. In these cases, you might put a little bit of delay or a little bit more reverb on the background. But the more that you amplify the contrast between the two, the more that there's chance for kind of excitement and intrigue. Here's another one called Money Trees by Kendrick Lamar. And this one I was actually looking up people's favorite hip hop mixes, and this was like Reddit's favorite hip hop mix. Apparently, it was like one of the most upvoted ones on a chain that was about hip hop mixing. So I thought I'd have a listen. I immediately heard the same kind of thing happening with contrast going on between the main and the background, but maybe a little bit more tastefully done. Let's take it right near the beginning.
Me and my niggas tryna get it, yeah, bitch. Yeah, bitch. Hit that house, nigga, tell me, is you with it, yeah, bitch. Yeah, bitch. Home invasion was persuasive. From 9 to 5, I know it's vacant, yeah, bitch. Yeah, bitch. Dreams of living life like rappers do. Back when condom rappers wasn't cool. They wasn't. I fucked Shireen and went to tell my bros. Then Usher Raymond Let It Burn came on. Hot sauce all that nighttime rhyming, yeah, bitch. Park the car.
So I think you hear what's going on here. Again, we have this slightly more kind of centered, dry, and slightly grainy, saturated, distorted lead vocal sound. And then we have this big ad-lib or background vocal sound that becomes more stereo. But this time, it has more reverb, and it's set further back, and it's darker than the lead. So when we were hearing Snoop, we had a slightly darker, slightly more reverby lead vocal, and then these really big wraparound, dry, upfront ad-libs. And here, it's a little bit the opposite, where we have a slightly drier, brighter main vocal and this slightly more pillowy, reverby background vocal. What they both have in common is, in these cases, we have bigger, wider backgrounds and ad-libs than we do our main vocal track. But it doesn't have to be that way. It can be exactly the opposite. And there are some tracks that I think do a brilliant job of making the main lead vocal sound so upfront and big by making backgrounds and ad-libs really small. These tracks that just had like the most contrast happen to be ones where people are making the backgrounds bigger than the lead. But you can do exactly the opposite. And in hindsight, I wish I'd loaded up 3 more examples that do exactly the opposite, but then this podcast episode would double in length. I've already gone almost 30 minutes and it would turn into like an hour-long podcast episode. So maybe I should do a part 2 of this. The other way of mixing hip-hop vocals. That would be like a addendum to this. But let's go a little bit further and see if we can find out what's happening in the chorus.
They think we had to free our mind. Then freeze that verse when we see dollar signs. You looking like an easy come up, yeah, bitch. A silver spoon, I know you come from, yeah, bitch. And that's a lifestyle that we never knew. Go at a revving for the revenue. Go Hollyberry or hallelujah.
And now all of a sudden, our vocal tone has changed, and we've added more substantial delay and wetness to that lead-centered vocal. Before, our lead-centered vocal, though it does have a little bit of ambience around, is relatively dry compared to the chorus ones. And the chorus ones sound even wetter because he's like faking a delay. He's saying, ya bish, ya bish. He's saying that, right? It's not an actual delay. But here, we're taking that kind of repeating delay, that same tempo, and adding it in as a repeating delay in the chorus. And this is another common hip-hop mixing mistake, is that people will have like basically an indistinguishable sound for their verse and chorus vocal. But here, there's just this slight shift. All of a sudden, we're bringing extra wetness, and we're taking that repeating motif that was in the chorus vocal and bringing it into the verse vocal. So let's check out that transition.
We never knew. Go at a revving for the revenue. Go Hollyberry or hallelujah. Pick your poison, tell me what you're doing. Everybody go respect the shooter, but the one in front of the gun lives forever.
So you hear now how these side panned vocals from the chorus take the sound of that centered vocal, that slightly brighter, more edgy and saturated sound, and it brings them out to the sides and then adds actual delay to them rather than him repeating the delay. Listen for that change one more time, from our centered vocal sound going out to the sides, replacing our prior backgrounds, and then adding actual delay.
And that's a lifestyle that we never knew. Go at a revving for the revenue. Go Hollyberry or hallelujah. Pick your poison, tell me what you're doing. Everybody go respect the shooter, but the one.
And you hear how subtle and down in the mix that delay is? That's where hip-hop delays usually belong. Like, it's almost disappearing. You almost have to listen into the track to hear the delay, but it's there.
Everybody go respect the shooter, but the one in front of the gun lives forever.
The one in front of the gun forever.
And I've been hustling.
Now, how's that for contrast? That's the first time we're hearing that vocal tone, right? Way reverby. We're taking this deeper voice, way reverby, and they're doing a fun thing with the panning, but it doesn't necessarily even need that to have contrast. Totally new tone.
Everybody go respect the shooter, but the one in front of the gun lives forever.
The front of the gun forever.
And I've been hustling.
Incredible amount of reverb on that, and now a faster repeating delay.
The gun forever.
And I've been hustling all day. This away, that away, through canals and
And man, that background almost hangs, right? It's almost like there's a super long reverb tail at the end of the last background line.
In front of the gun forever.
And I've been hustling all day, this away, that away, through canals and alleyways, just to say, money trees is the perfect place for shade, and that's just how I feel. Now, $8 might just.
Man, and then again, this delay, so masterful. I wouldn't be surprised if they're automating some of these delay lines. That's just how I feel, and it just disappears. You almost have to listen for it before it gets swallowed up by the next note.
This is the perfect place for shade, and that's just how I feel. Now.
So at this level, I think there's almost certainly automation on some of these delay returns to get them right into that sweet spot where they're just barely there and kind of disappearing into the next note. So that's another thing. Rather than just putting on a delay, set and forget, and if you want super extra masterful stuff, think about potentially automating your delay returns. So that's another thought for you. All right, I think this gets the big principles for you. The first one is make sure you can hear your low end, right? That's number one. It's less common. And if you can't hear your low end, get headphones that go down deep enough if you're not ready to put a whole bunch of acoustic treatment into your space and you don't want to do a million different car checks. There are headphones that go super deep, and you can check out some of my videos on the best headphones. There's some for $400 and under that are really good. That'll give you good, accurate picture of the low end, and you can complement that with looking at what your favorite records look like on a frequency analyzer, and then seeing yours. Now, ideally, you're not just looking, but you can also hear that deep by having decent headphones, or if you can afford it, enough acoustic treatment in your space. But number two would be make sure you're compressing your vocals enough. Man, sometimes like a hip hop mix sounds like it's not really there. The vocalist doesn't sound confident enough. The mix sounds kind of whack. And then you just put a bunch of like high ratio compression, fast attack, or even a limiter on the vocal, or even across the whole track. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, yeah. Oh man, now that dude believes what he's saying. And it came from literally compression and limiting. So don't undercompress and underlimit. If you're doing a lot of compression and limiting, be sure to see if you need de-essing, which I recommend should come at the end of your chain. We could look at why that would be in another episode. And then when it comes to your lead vocals and your backgrounds, please, if you're going to have them have the same exact sound, make sure that they're locked up really well, in really good sync. Or you can get away with a little bit less lock, although modern production styles, you probably want a decent amount of lock still, but you can get away with a little bit less lock if you accentuate their differences with contrast. In these examples today, we've been hearing really big, super wide, hard panned verse ad-libs and backgrounds compared to a somewhat smaller, centered sounding vocal. But in some of these cases, the big backgrounds were reverby and further back. In some cases, they were dry and further forward. But the big difference there is there was a contrast between how much wetness was on the centered vocal versus the backgrounds. There was contrast between how much top end was on each. So those are things you want to think about. Those are the dimensions in which they can sound different, right? Centered versus wide. That's one dimension. Front versus back, which is a couple of things. It is brightness versus darkness. It is wetness versus dryness. And it is more attack coming forward versus less attack going back. And you could also do the opposite. Even though we were focusing on big backgrounds compared to smaller mains, you can go super big main and have smaller backgrounds make that main sound like the biggest voice possible. I hope this stuff has been useful for you. If you want more and better insights than this, I would recommend checking out some of the great full-length courses or become a member over at SonicScoop or members.sonicscoop.com, because we can listen to your tracks next to some of your favorite references and hear exactly what separates the sound of your records from records you know that you love the sound of. What is separating you from your favorite tracks in whatever genre that you're working in? We wet our ears by listening to a few tracks and saying, oh yeah, this is what records sound like. This is what this dude's taste is like. Now let's listen to his and figure out what's the lowest hanging fruit. What are the exact things that you can improve? What do you need to change, if anything, about your kick drum sound, about your vocal sound? What is lacking and what are you doing well in your mixes? Check that over at members.sonicscoop.com. We've got a great community as well as regular mix feedback sessions with me and the whole group. And I got to tell you, a lot of people will come to have the feedback given on their track, but they'll stay for all the others because there's something to learn in literally every single one of these tracks that we go over. And there's principles to uncover in every one of them. If you want to go super deep, super nerdy, really improve the way that you work dramatically, that is, man, some of the best handful of bucks a month you can spend if you go to members.sonicscoop.com. But if you want to totally transform the way that you mix, you got to check out one of the full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. I don't know which way to point my screen here. There? Yeah. No, that way. No, that way. Yeah. Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified. They will change the way that you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. I got to tell you, if you go through the first 90 minutes of compression breakthroughs and go through the guided compression listening exercises with me, you will finally be able to hear things like attack and release settings on compressors with great detail in a way that you haven't before. You'll really get an understanding about how and why to use things like ratio, like threshold, and you'll get specific advice for compressing literally every single instrument in every single genre. Great course, or check out EQ Breakthroughs if you really want to learn to hear EQ ranges. I make it simple. If you feel like, man, I don't know what it is with these numbers of EQ, I'm never going to memorize all that stuff. You don't have to. I have a simple way with guided listening exercises and a whole bunch of audio examples that will change the way that you hear the whole frequency spectrum forever. And you'll be able to make more confident decisions more quickly with, again, tons of audio examples on every instrument in every genre. Also, big shout out and thanks to Sound Toys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Also, one last shout out to Baby Audio. They were on the channel earlier this Tuesday showing off their new dynamic resonance suppressor, Smooth Operator Pro. Check out that video. It just came out a couple of days ago. I hope you enjoy it. And there's a intro discount on there, which is like 40% off for this week. So you definitely want to check that out if you want something in that class of tools. Let me really quick dip in before I say goodbye into the comment section here. A whole bunch of great comments in here. Hamdayana says, good channel. Jordan says, this is great in light of what I'll be working on next. Rich Purnell says, hey, everybody, hope everybody's having a great Thursday. Rich, I hope to see you in the next members feedback session. We got a whole bunch of members here. Feudal Recordings, Jordan Benj. Feudal Recording says that one of the biggest hip-hop mixing mistakes is buying Yamaha HS8s instead of Cali IN8s, which are the same price. Wow, those monitors are the same price? I'm sorry, Yamaha. I love some of the things that you do, but my goodness, yeah, the Cali IN8s totally smoke the HSAs. If they're around the same price, my goodness. Yeah. Sorry, didn't mean to come out there with that opinion so hard, but yeah, great monitors. Very affordable ones too. Great info and analysis says the world needs a hero. No questions in here specifically, but if you want to ask questions, the best place to do that is check out the member section over at members.sonicscoop.com, where I answer all the questions that come in the forums, and I also do regular Q&A sessions where I'll answer your questions live. And you guys can even come on live with me in the Q&A sessions. We do it kind of like a call-in show, so if you want to share your camera and your mic, you can. Even if you want to share your screen in your DAW session, you can do that in the mix feedback sessions. It's a lot of fun, so check us out at members.sonicscoop.com, or check out our great full-length courses, Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystified, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They will change the way you work forever for the better, guaranteed, or your money back. Until next time, it's been great hanging out with you. See you in the next one.